The wagon creaked beneath Dorothy Everhart's weight, her skirts billowing momentarily against the splintered wooden planks before settling into a dejected heap around her like her spirits. It was the spring of 1876, and at 18 years old, she was being transported like cattle to a new owner, a traveling merchant named Silas Wilcox, with a reputation that had made even her callous stepfather hesitate before accepting his offer of $200. Dorothy wiped away a tear with trembling fingers, careful not to let the merchant see her distress. 3 days had passed since her stepfather Jeremiah had dragged her from her bedroom in the dead of night, informing her that he'd found a solution to their financial troubles. The farm outside Aurora, Colorado, had been failing for years, but Dorothy never imagined she would be the payment for its debts. "Stop your crying, girl," Silas called from his perch at the front of the wagon. "You'll fetch a higher price with pretty eyes, not swollen ones." His laugh was as dry as the parched road they traveled, and Dorothy felt a fresh wave of terror sweep through her. She understood her fate all too clearly now. Silas wasn't looking for a wife, he was a trader in flesh, planning to sell her to one of the brothels dotting the Western Territories. The realization had come gradually over their first day of travel, as his comments grew increasingly vulgar and his gaze more appraising. Dorothy closed her eyes, remembering her mother's grave not even a year old and how quickly Jeremiah had transformed after her passing. The drinking had started first, followed by the gambling debts. When he'd married her mother 5 years ago, he had seemed kind enough, if somewhat distant. Now she understood he had only wanted their small but prosperous farm, waiting for the moment her mother was gone to show his true nature. The wagon jolted over a rut in the road, jarring Dorothy from her thoughts. They were roughly 10 miles outside Aurora now, heading west along a trail that would eventually connect with larger settlements. Silas had mentioned something about a saloon owner in a mining town who paid top dollar for fresh faces. "Not much farther to the next town," Silas called back to her. "Then we'll rest for the night. Got a friend there who'll let us stay in his barn. Unless you'd prefer to start earning your keep early." He turned to leer at her, and Dorothy shrank against the side of the wagon. She had contemplated jumping from the moving vehicle several times, but where would she go? The vast Colorado landscape stretched in every direction, unforgiving to those without provisions or protection. And Silas had made it clear what would happen if she tried to flee. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Dorothy heard the approaching hoofbeats. Silas tensed, his hand moving toward the rifle propped beside him. "Who's there?" he called out, pulling the wagon to a halt. The rider appeared from around a bend in the trail, silhouetted against the golden afternoon light. Dorothy's heart leapt with a desperate, irrational hope. The man sat tall in the saddle of a magnificent chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders squared beneath a worn leather vest. A cowboy, by the look of him, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. "Afternoon," the stranger called, his voice deep and measured. "Fine day for traveling." "That it is," Silas answered cautiously. "We're just passing through." The cowboy's eyes shifted to Dorothy, taking in her tear-stained face and the rope binding her wrists, a precaution Silas had insisted upon after her one attempt to flee during the night. "Seems your passenger isn't too happy about the journey," the cowboy observed, bringing his horse alongside the wagon. Dorothy could see his face more clearly now, strong-jawed and weathered by sun and wind, with piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. "He couldn't have been more than 25 years old. My merchandise, my business," Silas retorted, his hand tightening on the rifle. "Best you move along, stranger." The cowboy's gaze hardened. "Merchandise, is it?" He looked directly at Dorothy. "That true, miss? You being sold?" Dorothy's throat constricted with fear, but she managed to nod. "My stepfather." She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enough," Silas barked, raising the rifle. "This ain't your concern, cowboy." In one fluid motion, the stranger drew his revolver and aimed it steadily at Silas. "I believe it is. I don't take kindly to men who trade in human lives." "She's mine, fair and legal," Silas protested. "Her stepfather signed her over." The cowboy's expression darkened. "No man has the right to sign away another's freedom." He kept his revolver trained on Silas while addressing Dorothy. "Miss, if you'd rather not continue with this gentleman, I'd be pleased to escort you elsewhere." Dorothy hardly dared to breathe. "Yes," she whispered, then found her voice. "Yes, please." Silas spat on the ground. "You'll regret this, cowboy. I paid good money for her." "And I reckon that's a loss you'll have to bear," the cowboy replied evenly. "Now, untie the lady." For a tense moment, Dorothy thought Silas might resist, but with a muttered curse, he set down the rifle and moved to the back of the wagon. His fingers fumbled with the knots binding her wrists, his face contorted with rage. "There," he said as the ropes fell away. "Take the ungrateful wench, but this ain't over." The cowboy dismounted, keeping his revolver ready. "I believe it is." He extended his free hand to Dorothy. "Madam." Her legs trembled as she stood, her cramped muscles protesting after days of confinement. The cowboy's hand was warm and calloused as he helped her down from the wagon, steadying her when she stumbled. "My bag," Dorothy said suddenly, pointing to a small satchel containing the few possessions she'd managed to grab before being forced from her home. The cowboy nodded and retrieved it with one hand, never lowering his revolver. "Now, Mr. Merchant, I suggest you continue on your way. Alone." Silas glared at them both, but eventually climbed back onto his wagon. "You can't protect her forever, cowboy," he threatened as he shook the reins. "Don't need forever," the cowboy replied. "Just long enough for you to be far from these parts." They watched as Silas drove away, dust billowing behind the wagon wheels. Only when he disappeared around a bend did the cowboy holster his weapon and turn to Dorothy. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Dorothy shook her head, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that she was free but completely alone in the world. "No, thank you, I don't know what would have happened if." "Best not to dwell on it," he said, offering a slight smile. "Name's Patrick Nichols. Friends call me Pat." "Dorothy Everhart," she replied, attempting to smooth her rumpled skirts. I'm afraid I have nowhere to go. My stepfather sold our farm to settle his debts before he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Patrick nodded in understanding. "There's a town about 5 miles west Silver Creek. Not much to look at, but they've got a decent boarding house. I can take you there, help you get settled." "Why would you help me?" Dorothy asked, wariness creeping back into her voice. Her recent experiences had taught her harsh lessons about men's motives. "Because it's the right thing to do," Patrick replied simply. "And because no one should be treated as property." He gestured to his horse. "Can you ride?" Dorothy nodded. She had grown up riding on the farm, though it had been some time since she'd been on horseback. "Good. You'll ride with me to Silver Creek, and we'll figure out the rest from there." He helped her mount before swinging up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the shared saddle. As they set off toward Silver Creek, Dorothy felt the warmth of the setting sun on her face. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Nichols," she said softly. "Pat," he corrected. "And you're welcome, Miss Everhart." The journey to Silver Creek passed in relative silence. Dorothy was acutely aware of Patrick's presence behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the careful way he held the reins to avoid touching her unnecessarily. His consideration was a stark contrast to Silas's leering threats and her stepfather's callous disregard. "Have you lived in these parts long?" Dorothy asked, breaking the silence. "Going on 3 years," Patrick replied. "I work at the Carter Ranch about 15 miles north of Silver Creek. Came out from Tennessee after the war, not much left for me back east." Dorothy nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. Many men had headed west after the Civil War, seeking new beginnings or escaping painful memories. "And do you like it here?" "In Colorado?" Patrick seemed to consider the question. "Most days. It's hard country but honest in its way. The mountains don't lie to you, and the work is straightforward." After a moment he added, "The winters are harsh, but there's something about watching spring come to these valleys that makes it worthwhile." His poetic observation surprised her. This man was more than just the capable cowboy who had rescued her. "What about you?" Patrick asked. "You mentioned a farm?" "Yes," Dorothy replied, pain lacing through her at the thought of her lost home. "Just outside Aurora. My mother and I worked it together after my father died when I was 12. Then she remarried and everything seemed fine until—" Her voice caught. "Until she took ill last year. She didn't survive the winter." Patrick's voice was gentle. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Dorothy whispered. "After she was gone, Jeremiah, my stepfather, changed. Started drinking, gambling. I tried to keep the farm running, but he sold off the livestock, piece by piece. Then 3 nights ago he came to my room and told me he'd found a solution to our debts." The memory made her shudder. "I didn't understand until I saw Silas counting out money in our kitchen." Patrick's jaw tightened, and Dorothy felt his posture stiffen behind her. "No man has the right," he muttered, echoing his earlier words. They crested a small rise, and the settlement of Silver Creek came into view, a collection of wooden buildings straddling a winding creek, nestled in a valley between rolling foothills. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and lanterns were being lit as evening approached. "It's not much," Patrick acknowledged, "but Sheriff Miller keeps the peace, and Mrs. Holloway runs a clean boarding house." As they rode down the main street, Dorothy was conscious of curious glances from the townspeople. A young woman arriving with a cowboy as night fell was bound to raise eyebrows. Patrick seemed unfazed, guiding his horse directly to a 2-story wooden building with a hand-painted sign. "Holloway Boarding House." A plump woman with silver-streaked hair appeared on the porch as they dismounted. "Patrick Nichols," she called. "Didn't expect to see you in town this week." "Evening, Mrs. Holloway," Patrick replied, touching the brim of his hat. "I've brought someone who needs lodging." Mrs. Holloway's shrewd eyes took in Dorothy's rumpled appearance and tear-stained face. "I see that," she said, her expression softening. "Come in, dear. You look like you could use a hot meal and a good night's rest." Dorothy hesitated, glancing back at Patrick. I have no money," she admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "I'll cover her board for a week," Patrick said quietly. "And see about finding her suitable employment." Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Very well, though I could use some help around the place myself. Cleaning rooms, serving breakfast, it's getting to be too much for these old bones." Hope flickered in Dorothy's chest. "I can work hard, Mrs. Holloway. I ran a farm for years." "We'll discuss it in the morning," Mrs. Holloway decided. "For now, let's get you settled." Patrick lifted Dorothy's small satchel from his saddle and handed it to her. "You'll be safe here," he assured her. "Mrs. Holloway is good people. Will I see you again?" Dorothy asked, surprising herself with the question. Something warmed in Patrick's blue eyes. "I'll check on you tomorrow. Got some business in town anyway." Dorothy nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from the man who had saved her. "Thank you again, Mr. Nichols, Pat. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Live well," he said simply. "That'll be payment enough." With that, he tipped his hat to both women and returned to his horse, leading it toward the livery stable down the street. Mrs. Holloway watched him go with an approving nod. "That's a good man," she commented. "Now let's get you inside, Miss Everhart, Dorothy Everhart." "Well, Miss Everhart, I suspect you have quite a story to tell, but that can wait until you've had some stew and a hot bath." Dorothy followed her into the boarding house, her mind still spinning with the day's events. From captivity to freedom in the span of hours, all because a cowboy with kind eyes had decided to intervene. For the first time since her mother's death, Dorothy allowed herself to feel something other than despair. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was its distant cousin possibility. The boarding house was clean and modestly furnished, smelling of pine soap and fresh bread. Mrs. Holloway led Dorothy to a small but comfortable room on the second floor, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt. "Bathrooms down the hall," Mrs. Holloway explained. "I'll have hot water brought up. Supper's in half an hour in the dining room downstairs." "Thank you," Dorothy said, setting her satchel on the bed. "I truly appreciate your kindness." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "This territory's hard on women alone. We have to look out for each other." She paused at the door. "Whatever brought you here, you're safe now." After Mrs. Holloway left, Dorothy sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry not tears of fear or despair, but of relief. She had escaped a fate worse than death, thanks to the intervention of a stranger. The thought of Patrick Nichols brought a warmth to her cheeks that had nothing to do with shame. The bath that followed was the first proper washing she'd had since leaving home. The hot water soothed her aching muscles, and the lavender-scented soap Mrs. Holloway provided felt like an almost unimaginable luxury after days in Silas's wagon. Clean and dressed in the only other gown, she possessed a simple blue cotton dress that had belonged to her mother. Dorothy made her way downstairs for supper. The dining room held a long table where several other boarders were already seated. Mrs. Holloway introduced her simply as Miss Everhart, who will be staying with us for a while, sparing her the need to explain her circumstances. The stew was hearty and delicious, accompanied by fresh bread that reminded Dorothy of her mother's baking. She ate slowly, savoring each bite and the simple pleasure of a meal taken in safety. After dinner, exhaustion overtook her, and she retired to her room. Sleep came swiftly, though her dreams were troubled by images of Silas's leering face and her stepfather counting money. Each time, just as terror threatened to overwhelm her, a cowboy on a chestnut horse would appear, driving the nightmares away. Dorothy woke to sunlight streaming through her window. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was in Silver Creek, safe in Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. After dressing, she made her way downstairs, where she found Mrs. Holloway kneading dough in the kitchen. "Good morning," Dorothy said hesitantly. "Is there something I can help with?" Mrs. Holloway looked up with an approving smile. "Good morning to you. You can start by setting the table for breakfast. We've got 5 boarders plus you and me." Dorothy set to work, grateful for the normalcy of the task. As she arranged plates and cutlery, Mrs. Holloway spoke casually. "Patrick stopped by earlier. Said he had errands to run, but would return this afternoon to see how you're settling in." Dorothy's heart quickened at the mention of his name. "He's very kind." "That he is," Mrs. Holloway agreed. "Not one to interfere in others' business generally, which makes me curious about how you two came to be acquainted." Dorothy hesitated, then decided that honesty was the best approach. Briefly, she explained about her stepfather's betrayal and Patrick's timely intervention. Mrs. Holloway listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Dorothy finished, the older woman wiped her hands on her apron and placed them firmly on her hips. "Well, that settles it. You'll stay here and work with me. Room, board, and a small wage. No girl should be without protection in these parts, especially one who might have unsavory characters looking for her. Dorothy felt a rush of gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. I promise I'll earn my keep. I've no doubt you will, the older woman replied. Now finish setting that table. The men will be down soon, hungry as bears. The morning passed in a flurry of activity as Dorothy helped serve breakfast, clean rooms, and learn the rhythms of the boarding house. The work was straightforward, if tiring, and far preferable to what might have awaited her had Patrick not intervened. Around midday, a young woman named Sarah arrived to help with the laundry. She was about Dorothy's age, with freckles scattered across her nose and a cheerful disposition. "So you're the girl Pat Nichols rescued," she said without preamble as they hung sheets on the line behind the house. Word travels fast in Silver Creek. Dorothy felt her cheeks flush. "I suppose it does," Sarah grinned. "Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him, you know. Pat's considered quite a catch, owns his own parcel of land north of here, saves most of his wages, and doesn't spend his nights at the saloon like most of the cowboys. I'm not." "That is, he was just being kind," Dorothy stammered, though she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach at the thought of him. Sarah hummed skeptically. "Well, kind or not, you're the first woman he's personally escorted to town in all the time I've known him." Before Dorothy could formulate a response, Mrs. Holloway called for Sarah, ending the conversation. As the afternoon progressed, Dorothy found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to Patrick. Would he really return as promised? And why did the prospect make her heart race? She was beating a rug on the back porch when she heard the distinctive sound of hooves on the packed dirt of the street. Looking up, she saw Patrick dismounting in front of the boarding house, his tall figure unmistakable even from a distance. Hastily smoothing her hair, Dorothy set aside the rug beater and moved to the front of the building. Patrick was speaking with Mrs. Holloway on the porch, his hat in his hands. He looked up as Dorothy approached, and something in his expression, a mix of relief and pleasure, sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Miss Everhart," he greeted her, "you're looking well today." "Thank you, Mr. Nichols, Pat," she corrected herself. "I feel much better." "Mrs." Holloway glanced between them with knowing eyes. "Miss Everhart has agreed to work here at the boarding house," she informed Patrick. "She's already proving invaluable." Patrick nodded approvingly. "That's good news. Silver Creek could use more hard-working folks." He hesitated, then added, "I wondered if you might spare her for an hour, Mrs. Holloway. I need to visit the general store and thought Miss Everhart might want to purchase a few necessities." Dorothy started to protest. She had no money, but Patrick continued smoothly. "I've collected the payment for your horse and wagon, Miss Everhart." She blinked in confusion. "My horse?" "The one your stepfather sold without permission," Patrick elaborated, his eyes conveying a message she understood instantly. "It wasn't much, but it should cover some basic supplies." Mrs. Holloway's expression suggested she wasn't fooled by the story, but she nodded her approval. "Of course. Take your time, Dorothy. Dinner won't be for hours yet." Patrick offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Dorothy placed her hand upon it. As they walked down the dusty main street, she whispered, "There was no horse, was there?" "No," he admitted quietly, "but you need some things, and I'd reckon you'd prefer to maintain your dignity rather than accept charity." His understanding of her pride touched something deep within her. "Thank you," she said simply. The general store was the largest establishment in Silver Creek, carrying everything from foodstuffs to fabric, tools to toys. The proprietor, Mr. Reynolds, greeted Patrick warmly. "What can I help you with today, Pat?" "Miss Everhart needs some basic necessities," Patrick explained. She's working at the boarding house now. Mr. Reynolds nodded, directing his attention to Dorothy. Welcome to Silver Creek, miss. What can I get for you? With Patrick's gentle encouragement, Dorothy selected several items: a hairbrush, some soap, a sturdy apron, and a few yards of fabric for a new dress. She moved hesitantly at first, but Patrick's quiet insistence that she get what she needed gradually overcame her reluctance. At the counter, Patrick smoothly handed over payment before Dorothy could object. It wasn't until they were outside that she whispered, "I'll pay you back, every cent." Patrick smiled down at her, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "I know you will, but there's no rush." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Dorothy gathering courage with each step, she finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why did you help me, Pat? Truly. Most men would have ridden past and not gotten involved." Patrick was silent for several paces, his expression thoughtful. "I had a sister," he said finally, "younger than me by 6 years. During the war, while I was away fighting, she fell on hard times. My parents were gone and he swallowed hard. She ended up in a situation not unlike what might have awaited you. By the time I got home, it was too late." Dorothy's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry." "She died 3 years ago," Patrick continued quietly. "Consumption, they said, but I think it was a broken spirit that really took her. I came west afterward, trying to outrun the guilt, I suppose, feeling like I'd failed to protect her." Dorothy placed her hand gently on his arm. "You couldn't have known." "Maybe not," he acknowledged. "But when I saw you in that wagon, bound and afraid, I couldn't ride past, not again." The raw honesty in his voice moved her deeply. "Then I'm doubly grateful, not just for myself, but because perhaps helping me might ease some of your pain." Patrick looked down at her, surprise and something warmer flickering in his eyes. "You're not what I expected, Dorothy Everhart." "Neither are you, Patrick Nichols," she replied softly. They had reached the boarding house, but neither seemed eager to part. Finally, Patrick cleared his throat. "I'll be in town for another day or two, handling some business for the ranch. Perhaps you might join me for supper tomorrow evening. There's a small cafe that serves decent food." Dorothy hesitated, aware that being seen dining alone with a man might spark gossip, yet the prospect of refusing him seemed far worse than any wagging tongues. "I'd like that," she said, "if Mrs. Holloway can spare me." "I'll speak with her," Patrick promised, a smile lighting his features. "Until tomorrow, then." As he walked away, leading his horse back toward the livery stable, Dorothy clutched her packages to her chest, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. In the span of 2 days, her life had transformed completely from captivity to something that, while uncertain, held the promise of something good. That evening, as she sat in her small room sewing a new nightgown from the fabric she'd purchased, Dorothy allowed herself to imagine a future. Not the one that had been forced upon her by her stepfather's cruelty, but one of her own choosing. And for the first time, she realized that future might include a tall cowboy with kind eyes and a gentle heart. The next day passed in a blur of domestic tasks. Dorothy threw herself into her work, eager to prove her worth to Mrs. Holloway and distract herself from thoughts of the evening ahead. She scrubbed floors until they shone, turned mattresses, and helped prepare a stew for the boarders' dinner. Mrs. Holloway watched her with a knowing smile. "You're certainly enthusiastic today," Dorothy blushed. "I just want to earn my keep." "Hum," the older woman hummed, much as Sarah had done. "Nothing to do with a certain cowboy coming to call this evening. He mentioned supper," Dorothy admitted, her cheeks warming further. "But I wasn't sure if you could spare me." Mrs. Holloway laughed. "Girl, you've done the work of 3 people today. Go and enjoy yourself. Just be back by 9. I run a respectable house." At precisely 6 o'clock, Patrick arrived at the boarding house, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his usual cowboy hat replaced by a less weathered one. Dorothy had done her best with her appearance as well, wearing her blue dress with a freshly pressed collar and her hair neatly arranged. "You look lovely," Patrick said as she descended the stairs. "Thank you," Dorothy replied, accepting his offered arm. "So do you." "I mean," she broke off, flustered. Patrick chuckled. "I know what you meant." Mrs. Holloway watched their departure with the satisfaction of a matchmaker whose plans were proceeding accordingly. 9 o'clock, she reminded them. The café was a small establishment run by a French immigrant named Claude, who had come west seeking gold and found a more reliable income in feeding hungry miners and cowboys. The interior was simple but clean, with checkered tablecloths and candles providing a touch of elegance. Patrick held Dorothy's chair and ordered for them, both after consulting her preferences. As they waited for their meal, conversation flowed more easily than Dorothy had expected. Patrick told her about his life on the Carter Ranch, about his dreams of someday having his own spread, and about the beauty of the Colorado wilderness he'd come to love. In turn, Dorothy shared stories of her childhood on the farm with her parents, her mother's strength after her father's death, and her own hopes for the future now tentatively reforming after the disruption of recent events. "I always thought I'd marry a farmer," she admitted. "Someone who understood the rhythms of planting and harvest. But now—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express the shift in her perspective. "Now," Patrick prompted gently. Dorothy met his gaze across the table. "Now I think perhaps there are many paths a life can take. And sometimes the unexpected ones might lead to something better than what we had planned." Patrick's eyes warmed. "I believe that too." Their meal arrived, hearty beef stew with fresh bread interrupting the moment. As they ate, Patrick hesitantly broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began. "I'm concerned that Silas might return looking for you. Men like that don't take kindly to losing what they consider their property." Dorothy's stomach clenched at the thought. "Do you think he would?" "It's possible," Patrick acknowledged. "Which is why I spoke with Sheriff Miller this morning, told him the circumstances without compromising your privacy. He's agreed to keep an eye out for Silas or your stepfather." "Thank you," Dorothy said, touched by his foresight. "I hadn't even thought of that." "There's something else," Patrick continued, his expression serious. "I don't mean to alarm you, but I believe you should know. I asked the sheriff to send a telegraph to the authorities in Aurora inquiring about your stepfather. The reply came this afternoon." Dorothy set down her fork, a sense of foreboding washing over her. "What did it say?" "Jeremiah has been arrested," Patrick said gently. "It seems selling you wasn't his only crime. He's been charged with fraud and theft. Apparently he'd been forging notes and stealing from neighbors for months. The farm is being held as evidence, but eventually it will likely be sold to repay his debts." Dorothy absorbed this information slowly. The farm, her childhood home, her mother's pride, was truly lost to her now. Yet strangely, the knowledge brought more relief than pain. "I suspected something like that might happen," she said finally. "He'd been acting strangely for months, always sneaking around, hiding papers when I entered a room." "I'm sorry," Patrick said, reaching across the table to touch her hand briefly. "I know that was your home." "It was," Dorothy agreed, "but perhaps it's time for a new beginning." Patrick's expression brightened. "That's a brave way to look at it." The remainder of their meal passed pleasantly, the conversation turning to lighter topics. Patrick told amusing stories about the animals on the ranch, and Dorothy shared memories of the more light-hearted moments from her childhood. All too soon, it was time to return to the boarding house. The spring evening was mild, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Patrick offered Dorothy his arm again as they walked. "I've enjoyed this evening," he said, his deep voice warm in the gathering dusk. "So have I," Dorothy replied honestly. "More than I would have thought possible a few days ago." They paused at the foot of the boarding house steps, reluctant to end the evening. Dorothy gathered her courage and asked the question that had been nagging at her. "How long will you be in town?" Patrick's expression grew regretful. "I have to return to the ranch tomorrow. There's a cattle drive starting next week that I need to prepare for." "Oh," Dorothy tried to hide her disappointment. "Of course, you have responsibilities. But I'll be back in Silver Creek in about 3 weeks," Patrick added quickly. "Sooner if I can manage it." And he hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "And I'd like to call on you properly if you'd permit it." Dorothy's heart leapt. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. Then, with gentle deliberation, Patrick bent and pressed a soft kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Dorothy," he whispered. "Good night, Pat," she replied, her skin tingling where his lips had touched. She watched him walk away, a silhouette against the star-scattered sky, and felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope, yes, but also a tender emotion she wasn't yet ready to name. The following 3 weeks passed with agonizing slowness for Dorothy. She threw herself into her work at the boarding house, gradually learning all the intricacies of its operation. Mrs. Holloway proved to be a fair employer and a kind mentor, teaching Dorothy not only about running a boarding house, but also about navigating life in a frontier town. "A woman alone needs to be twice as smart and 3 times as cautious as a man," she advised Dorothy one evening as they sat mending linens. "But that doesn't mean you can't build a good life here." Dorothy nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "Have you always lived in Silver Creek, Mrs. Holloway?" "Lord, no," the older woman chuckled. "I came out from Boston after my husband died in '63. He was a Union officer, killed at Gettysburg. I had no children, no family to speak of, and a desperate desire to leave behind the places that reminded me of him." "That must have been difficult," Dorothy said, thinking of her own losses. Mrs. Holloway's eyes grew distant. "It was. The journey west nearly killed me. Indians, storms, disease in the wagon train, but I survived. Bought this place with what was left of my husband's life insurance and built something for myself." She looked at Dorothy with sudden intensity. "That's what women do, my dear. We rebuild." The words stayed with Dorothy as the days passed. She was rebuilding too, she realized. Creating a new life from the ashes of the old. On her days off, she explored Silver Creek, making acquaintances and gradually finding her place in the community. Sarah introduced her to other young women in town, and Dorothy was invited to join a sewing circle that met weekly in the church basement. But always, her thoughts returned to Patrick. Would he remember his promise to call on her? Or had the connection she felt been merely a product of gratitude and circumstance? 24 days after his departure, not that she was counting, Dorothy was sweeping the front porch of the boarding house when a familiar figure on horseback appeared at the end of the street. Her heart leapt, and she had to force herself to continue her task with at least a pretense of calm. Patrick dismounted in front of the boarding house, leading his horse by the reins. He looked tired but smiled broadly when he saw her. "Miss Everhart," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "The porch has never been in better hands." Dorothy laughed, suddenly shy. "Mr. Nichols." "Welcome back to Silver Creek." "I promised I'd return," he said simply. "So you did." She set the broom aside. "Was your cattle drive successful?" "Very. Got a good price in Denver." His expression grew serious. "I have something to tell you if you have a moment." Dorothy's stomach tightened with apprehension. "Of course." Patrick secured his horse to the hitching post and joined her on the porch. "I received word about Silas," he said without preamble. "He won't be bothering you." "What happened?" Dorothy asked, mixed emotions flooding through her. "He tried his scheme with another girl in a town west of here. But this time, her brothers caught up with him. He's in jail now, facing multiple charges." Patrick's jaw tightened. "He'll be away for a very long time." Relief washed over Dorothy. "Thank you for telling me." "There's more," Patrick continued. "Your stepfather's trial concluded last week. He's been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison." And he hesitated. "And the judge has determined that the farm rightfully belongs to you as your mother's heir." Jeremiah never legally added his name to the deed. Dorothy stared at him in shock. "The farm is mine." "It is," Patrick confirmed. "Though I'm afraid it's in poor condition." Jeremiah neglected it badly. Dorothy's mind raced. The farm, her childhood home, was hers again. Yet the thought of returning to Aurora, of trying to rebuild alone, filled her with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I've found a place here, work I'm good at, but that land, it was my mother's pride." Patrick looked at her with understanding. "You don't have to decide immediately. The courts will hold it for a reasonable period." Dorothy nodded, grateful for his reassurance. "How did you learn all this?" "I made inquiries in Denver," Patrick explained. I needed to know you were truly safe." The care implicit in his actions touched her deeply. "Thank you, Pat." Mrs. Holloway chose that moment to appear in the doorway. "Patrick Nichols, as I live and breathe. Are you planning to stand on my porch all day, or will you come in for coffee?" Patrick grinned. "Coffee sounds wonderful, Mrs. Holloway. Thank you." Inside, over steaming cups at the kitchen table, Patrick outlined his plans for the coming weeks. "I'll be in town for at least 10 days, he explained. "Mr. Carter has business here and I'm helping with some purchases for the ranch." 10 days. Dorothy couldn't keep the pleasure from her voice. "Yes," Patrick confirmed, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her blush. "I was hoping I might call on you properly during that time. Perhaps take you for a ride this Sunday if Mrs. Holloway can spare you." Mrs. Holloway waved a dismissive hand. "Of course she can be spared. The girl works harder than any 2 people I've employed before." And so began a courtship as proper as any in Silver Creek had witnessed. Patrick called at the boarding house each evening after his work was done, sometimes taking Dorothy for walks along the creek, other times simply sitting with her on the front porch swing, talking as the sun set. On Sunday, as promised, he arrived with 2 horses, his own chestnut stallion and a gentle mare borrowed from a friend. They rode into the foothills beyond town, Patrick showing Dorothy his favorite spots. A meadow carpeted with wildflowers, a stand of aspen trees whose leaves shimmered like gold coins in the breeze, a high ridge that offered views all the way to the distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Dorothy breathed, taking in the panorama. "I never imagined such vastness." "That's what I love about it," Patrick said, watching her rather than the view. "The endless possibilities." Their eyes met, and Dorothy felt something shift between them, a deepening of the connection that had begun on a dusty road weeks earlier. As Patrick's 10 days in Silver Creek drew to a close, Dorothy found herself dreading his departure. Their time together had been a revelation she'd discovered in him, a man of integrity, kindness, and surprising depth. He made her laugh, challenged her thinking, and most importantly, made her feel valued for herself. On his final evening in town, Patrick took Dorothy to supper at Claude's Cafe again. The meal was delicious, but Dorothy found she had little appetite, knowing their time was running short. "When will you return to Silver Creek?" she asked as they lingered over coffee. Patrick set down his cup, his expression serious. That depends partly on you, Dorothy. On me, she echoed, confused. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Patrick began, his voice low and earnest, about the future, about what I want from life. He reached across the table and took her hand. I know we've known each other only a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything than I am of my feelings for you. Dorothy's heart began to race. Pat, please, let me finish, he requested gently. I'm not a wealthy man, but I have savings. I've been buying parcels of land north of here for the past 2 years, building up enough for a small ranch of my own. It's not much yet, a cabin, some fencing, a few head of cattle, but it has potential. He squeezed her hand, his blue eyes intent on hers. I had planned to leave Mr. Carter's employ next spring to work my own land full-time, but recent events have made me reconsider my timeline. What do you mean? Dorothy asked, hardly daring to hope she understood his direction. Patrick took a deep breath. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, Dorothy. Not immediately, I know this is sudden and you deserve time to be sure, but perhaps by autumn, if your feelings align with mine. Dorothy stared at him, momentarily speechless. In the weeks since he'd rescued her from Silas's wagon, she had come to care deeply for Patrick. But marriage, it seemed both terrifyingly sudden and absolutely right. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to answer now, Patrick assured her. I understand this is unexpected, and there's the matter of your farm to consider as well. Dorothy thought of the farm in Aurora, her childhood home, filled with memories of her parents. Yet the thought of returning there alone held little appeal compared to the prospect of building a new life with Patrick. The farm is part of my past, she said slowly. A cherished part, but perhaps not my future. Hope kindled in Patrick's eyes. Does that mean you're considering my proposal? Dorothy found herself smiling. It means I'd like to see this land of yours, to understand what you're offering before I give you an answer. Patrick's face lit with joy. That's fair, more than fair. I can arrange it for next week if Mrs. Holloway will grant you a day away. I think she might, Dorothy replied, thinking of the older woman's knowing smiles and gentle encouragement of their courtship. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, the night air sweet with the scent of pine and possibility. At the bottom of the steps, Patrick turned to face her. I leave tomorrow at dawn, he said, regret coloring his voice. But I'll return in 6 days on Saturday to take you to see the land. He hesitated, then added softly, whatever you decide, Dorothy, know that meeting you has changed my life for the better. Without giving himself time to reconsider, he bent and kissed her, not on the cheek this time, but gently on the lips. The contact was brief but left Dorothy's heart racing. Until Saturday, she whispered. Until Saturday, he echoed, reluctantly stepping back. The 6 days until Patrick's return passed with excruciating slowness for Dorothy. She found herself distracted during her chores, earning good-natured teasing from Mrs. Holloway and knowing smiles from Sarah. He's going to propose, isn't he? Sarah asked as they hung laundry together. I can see it in your face something's happened, Dorothy blushed. He already has, in a way, but I haven't given him an answer yet. Sarah squealed with delight. I knew it. Oh, Dorothy, how romantic, rescued by a handsome cowboy who falls in love with you. It's not as simple as that, Dorothy protested, though her heart skipped at the word love. We've known each other such a short time. Time doesn't matter when it's right, Sarah declared with the confidence of youth. My parents knew after 2 weeks of courtship that they were meant for each other. They've been married 23 years now. Dorothy considered this. Her own parents had had a long courtship, nearly a year, before marrying. But they had been young, 18 and 20, while she and Patrick were older, with clearer understandings of themselves and what they wanted from life. On Saturday morning, Dorothy rose before dawn, dressing carefully in her best skirt and a new shirtwaist she'd sewn from fabric purchased with her first wages. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her hair, anticipation and nervousness battling within her. Mrs. Holloway appeared in her doorway holding a small package. "A gift," she said, extending it to Dorothy, "for your outing today." Inside was a pretty bonnet, trimmed with blue ribbon that matched Dorothy's eyes. "Mrs. Holloway, I couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," the older woman interrupted. "Every young woman should have something nice when she's considering a marriage proposal." Dorothy looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" Mrs. Holloway laughed. "My dear, I've been young and in love, and I've watched that boy look at you like you hung the moon. Now try it on." The bonnet fit perfectly, framing Dorothy's face and bringing out the color in her cheeks. Mrs. Holloway nodded in satisfaction. "There. Patrick Nichols won't know what hit him." Patrick arrived precisely at 9, riding his chestnut stallion and leading a sweet-faced mare. His face lit up when Dorothy emerged from the boarding house, and he dismounted quickly to greet her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Dorothy replied, touching the bonnet self-consciously. "Mrs. Holloway's gift." "I'll have to thank her," Patrick said, helping Dorothy mount the mare. "It's about a 2-hour ride to my land. Are you comfortable?" Dorothy nodded, settling into the saddle. She had always loved riding, though opportunities had been scarce since her mother's illness. "Lead the way." They rode north out of Silver Creek, following a winding trail that climbed gradually into the foothills. Patrick pointed out landmarks as they traveled: a lightning-struck tree that marked the boundary of Carter land, a creek that ran strong even in late summer, a rocky outcrop shaped like a sleeping bear. "It's all so vast," Dorothy marveled, taking in the sweeping vistas of pine forest and rolling meadows. "That's what struck me when I first came west," Patrick agreed. "In Tennessee, the mountains crowd close and the valleys are narrow. Here you can breathe." As they crested a ridge around midday, Patrick reined in his horse. "There," he said, gesturing to the valley below them. "That's my land." Dorothy followed his pointing finger and gasped softly. The valley was a natural bowl, sheltered by hills on 3 sides and open to the south. A small cabin stood near a copse of trees, with a barn and corral beside it. A creek meandered through the center of the valley, its banks lined with cottonwoods. In the meadows, perhaps 20 head of cattle grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," Dorothy breathed. Pride was evident in Patrick's voice as he described his holdings. 160 acres filed under the Homestead Act. I've proved up on most of it now. The cabin's not much, but it's solid. I built it myself last summer." He pointed to different areas as he spoke. "That rise to the west makes good winter grazing. The creek runs year-round, even in drought years. And I've planted an orchard behind the cabin, apple and cherry trees. They won't bear for a few years yet, but someday." His voice trailed off, and Dorothy understood he was sharing not just his current achievements but his vision for the future. A future he was asking her to share. "Show me the cabin," she requested. They rode down into the valley, the horses picking their way carefully along a well-worn trail. As they drew closer, Dorothy could see that while small, the cabin had been built with care. The logs were neatly notched, the roof was tight, and someone had planted flowers along the front path. "Mrs. Carter helped with those," Patrick explained, noticing her gaze. "She said a house needs flowers to feel welcoming." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a wooden table and chairs before it. A cast-iron cookstove stood in one corner, shelves above it holding a few basic dishes and cooking implements. A curtain partially separated the main room from a smaller space containing a bed frame with a straw mattress. It's not what you're used to, I know, Patrick said, suddenly uncertain. And it would need work to make it properly comfortable for a lady. Dorothy turned slowly, taking in the sturdy walls, the swept floor, the care evident in every detail. This was a home built with hope and hard work, not unlike the farm her parents had created years ago. "It's a good start," she said softly. "A very good start." Relief washed over Patrick's features. "You think so?" Dorothy nodded, moving to the small window that looked out over the valley. "I can see why you love it here." Patrick came to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I know it's asking a lot," he said quietly, "for you to leave the security you found in Silver Creek to take a chance on me in this place. If you need more time," Dorothy turned to face him, gathering her courage. "I don't need more time, Pat." His expression stilled. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I know my heart," Dorothy said simply. "These past weeks have shown me what kind of man you are: kind, honorable, hardworking. The sort of man my father was, the sort I always hoped to marry." She took a deep breath. "If your offer still stands, my answer is yes." For a moment, Patrick seemed frozen in disbelief. Then joy transformed his features and he reached for her hands, clasping them in his own. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "This life won't be easy, especially at first." Dorothy smiled, squeezing his hands. "I'm certain. I've never been afraid of hard work, and I'd rather face challenges with you than ease without you." Patrick's answering smile was radiant. Gently, he drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure. "I love you, Dorothy Everhart," he whispered against her hair. "I think I started falling the moment I saw you in that wagon, so brave despite your fear." Dorothy leaned back to look up at him, her heart full to bursting. "And I love you, Patrick Nichols, my rescuer, my future." Their second kiss was different from the first, deeper, a promise sealed between them. When they finally parted, both were breathless and laughing with the joy of new beginnings. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring their land. He showed her the spring house where milk and butter could be kept cool, the vegetative garden he'd started that summer, and the plans he had for expanding the cabin once they were married. "When do you want to have the wedding?" he asked as they sat by the creek, sharing the picnic lunch Mrs. Holloway had packed for them. Dorothy considered. "Autumn would be nice," she suggested. "After harvest time, when things slow down at the ranch." She hesitated, then added, "That would also give me time to resolve the matter of my family's farm." Patrick nodded in understanding. "Have you decided what you want to do about it?" "I think I have," Dorothy said slowly. "I'd like to sell it. Use the money to help build our future here. But first I should go back, just once, to say goodbye properly and collect anything of my mother's that might remain." "Of course," Patrick agreed immediately. "We could make the journey next month, before the cattle need moving to winter pastures. It's about a 3-day ride to Aurora from here." The thought of returning to the scene of so much pain was daunting, but with Patrick beside her, Dorothy knew she could face it. "Thank you," she said simply, "for understanding." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they reluctantly prepared to return to Silver Creek. Before mounting their horses, Patrick drew Dorothy close once more. "Next time you come here," he promised, "it will be to stay." The weeks that followed were filled with preparations. Dorothy continued working at the boarding house, saving every penny for her new life. Mrs. Holloway, delighted by the engagement, began helping Dorothy assemble a simple trousseau: linens, kitchen implements, and a few pretty items for her new home. "Every bride deserves something beautiful," she insisted when Dorothy protested the expense of a porcelain tea set. "Patrick can provide the necessities, but these touches are what make a house a home." Sarah and the other young women in town threw Dorothy a small party, presenting her with handmade gifts and sharing advice about married life that ranged from practical to scandalous, leaving Dorothy blushing but grateful for their friendship. In mid-September, as promised, Patrick arranged for their journey to Aurora. They traveled by horseback, camping along the trail at night, arriving at the outskirts of the town on the third day. Dorothy's heart pounded as they approached the farm. From a distance, she could see that the fields lay fallow, the crops unplanted and untended. As they drew closer, the house came into view, weathered but still standing, though with an air of neglect that pierced Dorothy's heart. "Are you all right?" Patrick asked softly as they reined in their horses before the gate. Dorothy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This had been her home for 18 years, the place where she had been both happiest and most miserable. The memories washed over her, her father teaching her to ride in the south pasture, her mother singing as she kneaded bread in the kitchen, the terrible night when Jeremiah had sold her like chattel. Patrick dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. His hand on her arm was steadying, grounding her in the present even as the past threatened to overwhelm her. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll wait here if you want to go in alone." Dorothy considered, then shook her head. "No, I'd like you with me." Together, they walked up the overgrown path to the house. The door was unlocked, common in rural areas, though now it spoke more of abandonment than trust. Inside, the house was much as Dorothy remembered, though dustier and emptier. Some furniture remained, but many items had been sold by Jeremiah to fund his vices. Room by room, Dorothy moved through the house, touching familiar objects, saying silent goodbyes. In her mother's bedroom, she found a cedar chest still containing quilts her mother had made, family linens, and a few treasured mementos. These, she decided, would come with her to her new home. In her own small room, little remained beyond the bed and a simple dresser. But tucked in the back of a drawer, overlooked in Jeremiah's haste, she found her mother's cameo brooch, the one piece of jewelry her mother had treasured, passed down from her own grandmother. "She would have wanted you to have this for your wedding," Patrick said as Dorothy showed him the brooch, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes," Dorothy agreed, closing her hand around the small treasure. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said she wanted me to find a man with a kind heart and steady hands." Patrick smiled, drawing her close. "I wish I could have known her." They spent the remainder of the day sorting through what was worth salvaging and what could be left behind. The following morning, Patrick arranged to meet with the town's lawyer, who confirmed that as her mother's sole heir, Dorothy had full rights to sell the property. "There's a family looking to buy land in this area," the lawyer informed them. "Good people with 4 children. They've been saving for years." Dorothy felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "I'd like them to have it," she decided. "A family should live here, children should grow up in these fields." The sale was arranged with surprising speed, and by the time they left Aurora 3 days later, Dorothy had the deed of sale and a bank draft that represented the beginning of her and Patrick's future together. The return journey to Silver Creek seemed shorter somehow, filled with plans and dreams rather than apprehension. Patrick spoke of expanding the cabin before winter set in, of the spring calving they could expect, of the garden Dorothy might want to plant when the snow melted. "I was thinking we might be married at the end of October," he suggested as they made camp on their final night on the trail. "If that suits you," Dorothy, tending the small fire between them, looked up with a smile. "It suits me perfectly." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Patrick divided his time between his duties at the Carter Ranch and working on their cabin, adding a proper kitchen and enlarging the main room to create a more comfortable living space. Dorothy gave notice at the boarding house, though Mrs. Holloway insisted she stay on until the wedding. "Where else would you go, child? Besides, I need time to train your replacement." Word of the upcoming nuptials spread through Silver Creek, and to Dorothy's surprise, many in the community offered help and gifts. Mr. Reynolds from the general store presented them with a set of sturdy dishes. Claude from the cafe promised to bake their wedding cake. Even Sheriff Miller contributed, offering a fine woolen blanket his wife had woven before her passing. "Folks respect Patrick," Mrs. Holloway explained when Dorothy expressed surprise at the generosity. "He's helped many of them over the years, expecting nothing in return. And they like you too, my dear. You've become one of us." The sentiment touched Dorothy deeply. In the months since Patrick had rescued her from Silas's wagon, she had found not just love but community, something she had lost in the difficult years after her mother's remarriage. October brought crisp mornings and golden afternoons, the aspen trees flaming yellow against the evergreen forests. On the 28th day of the month, Dorothy stood in her room at the boarding house, Sarah helping her dress for her wedding. Her gown was simple but elegant cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem, work she had done herself in the evenings. Her mother's cameo was pinned at her throat, and Mrs. Holloway's blue ribboned bonnet crowned her carefully arranged hair. "You look beautiful," Sarah declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Patrick won't be able to take his eyes off you." Dorothy smiled, a mixture of nervousness and joy fluttering in her stomach. "I can hardly believe this is happening. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over." Sarah squeezed her hands. "Instead, it's just beginning." The ceremony took place in Silver Creek's small church, decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming wildflowers. Mr. and Mrs. Carter stood as witnesses, having come to town specifically for the occasion. Mrs. Holloway sat in the front pew, beaming like a proud mother. But Dorothy saw little of this as she walked down the short aisle. Her eyes were fixed on Patrick, standing before the minister in a new suit, his face alight with love and promise. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that all the pain of her past had led her to this man, this future. The minister's words were traditional, spoken with warmth to the young couple before him. Dorothy and Patrick had chosen to write their own vows as well. Simple declarations of love and commitment that brought tears to many eyes in the small congregation. "I, Patrick James Nichols, take you, Dorothy Marie Everhart, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Patrick began, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "I promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life, to protect and provide for you, to be your partner in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want, from this day forward." Dorothy's voice trembled slightly as she repeated similar words, adding, "You found me when I was lost, and in loving you, I have found myself. I give you my heart, my trust, and my future." When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Patrick's kiss was tender yet filled with promise, a beginning rather than an ending. The celebration that followed at the boarding house was joyful if modest. Claude outdid himself with the wedding feast, and Mr. Reynolds contributed several bottles of good wine. There was music and dancing, laughter and a few happy tears. As evening fell, Patrick and Dorothy slipped away from the festivities, mounting their horses for the ride to their home. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on sending ahead provisions and having the cabin prepared for their arrival, sparing them the need to stay in town for their wedding night. The journey took place under a rising full moon, bathing the landscape in silver light. They rode side by side, occasionally exchanging glances and smiles, the weight of the day's events and the promise of the night ahead creating a sweet tension between them. When they crested the final ridge, and the cabin came into view, Dorothy gasped in delight. Lanterns had been hung from the porch rafters, casting a warm golden glow that welcomed them home. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth against the October chill. Mrs. Carter arranged it, Patrick explained as they dismounted. Said newlyweds shouldn't have to build their own fire. He lifted Dorothy into his arms before she could respond, carrying her across the threshold in accordance with tradition. Inside, the cabin was transformed from the simple space she had first seen. New curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt covered the bed, and a small vase of late autumn flowers graced the table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nichols," Patrick said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "It's perfect," Dorothy whispered, leaning into his embrace. Everything is perfect. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and deepening love for the newlyweds. Winter came early that year, blanketing their valley in snow by mid-November. The days grew short, the nights long and cold, but within their snug cabin, Patrick and Dorothy created a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. They established routines, Patrick tending the livestock in the bitter dawn, Dorothy keeping the home fires burning and preparing meals from their carefully stored provisions. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, talking, reading aloud from Patrick's small collection of books, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence that comes with true companionship. December brought their first Christmas together. They exchanged modest gifts: a new hat Dorothy had knitted for Patrick, a rocking chair he had secretly built for her in the barn during the short daylight hours. On Christmas Eve, they invited the Carters and a few neighboring ranchers for a simple celebration, filling the cabin with laughter and goodwill. By February, as winter's grip began to loosen, Dorothy had news that brought tears of joy to Patrick's eyes. "A baby," he whispered, placing his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "Are you certain?" Dorothy nodded, covering his hand with her own. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it when we were in town yesterday. He thinks the baby will come in late August." Patrick gathered her close, his joy beyond words. Later that night, as they lay together in their bed, he whispered plans for the future: a cradle he would build, the room they would add to the cabin, the lessons he would teach their child about the land and the animals. Spring brought new life to their valley calves in the pastures, buds on the trees Patrick had planted, wildflowers carpeting the meadows. Dorothy's body changed too, her belly swelling gently with the new life within. In May, they received unexpected news. A letter arrived from Aurora, forwarded by Mrs. Holloway. Jeremiah had died in prison, a victim of consumption that had swept through the facility. Dorothy received the news with mixed emotions: not grief, exactly, but a certain solemnity at the closing of that chapter in her life. "Are you all right?" Patrick asked that evening, finding her sitting on the porch, the letter in her lap. "Yes," Dorothy said after a moment's reflection. "I didn't love him, not after what he did, but he was part of my mother's life, and for a time he made her happy. I can be grateful for that much at least." Patrick nodded, understanding as always. "You have a generous heart, Dorothy Nichols. It's one of the many reasons I love you." Summer brought long days of work and preparation. Patrick hired 2 young men from town to help build an addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom for them, and a small nursery for the coming baby. Dorothy planted a larger garden than the previous year, canning and preserving for the winter months ahead. Their small herd had grown with the spring calving, and Patrick spoke of hiring a permanent hand to help with the increasing workload. The land was proving fruitful, their hard work paying dividends in security and prosperity. In late August, as the first hints of autumn touched the aspen leaves, their son was born after a long but uncomplicated labor. They named him Thomas James Nichols Thomas for Dorothy's father, James for Patrick's. "He's perfect," Patrick whispered, cradling his newborn son while Dorothy rested. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and your eyes, I think. But your chin, Dorothy observed sleepily. And I suspect he'll have your height. Patrick placed the baby gently in the cradle he had crafted with his own hands. "Rest now," he told Dorothy, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You've done the hardest work today." As autumn painted the valley in red and gold, the small family settled into new rhythms. Thomas proved to be a good-natured baby, quick to smile and slow to cry. Dorothy recovered her strength gradually, grateful for the help of neighboring women who brought meals and advice in equal measure. 1 year to the day after their wedding, Patrick surprised Dorothy with a special dinner after Thomas had been put to bed. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, raising a glass of wine in toast. "This has been the best year of my life." Dorothy smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Mine too, though I hope it's just the first of many." "It will be," Patrick promised. "I have plans, you know." "Tell me," Dorothy encouraged, loving the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of the future. "I'm thinking we should add to the herd next spring," Patrick began. "We have the pasture for it, and beef prices are strong. And perhaps in a few years, when Thomas is older, and if we're blessed with more children, we might build a proper house. Nothing fancy, but something with rooms for everyone and a big kitchen for you." Dorothy's heart swelled with love for this man who dreamed not of wealth or grandeur, but of creating a secure and happy life for his family. "I'd like that," she said softly, "though I'm quite content with what we have now." "As am I," Patrick agreed, lifting her hand to his lips. "More than content, blessed beyond measure." Later, as they stood on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear autumn sky, Dorothy reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the desperate fear of that day in Silas's wagon to this moment of perfect peace, it seemed almost miraculous. "What are you thinking?" Patrick asked, his arm around her waist. Dorothy leaned into him, grateful for his steady presence. "I was thinking about how life can change in an instant. How the worst day of my life led me to the best years I could imagine." Patrick tightened his embrace. "I thank God every day that I was on that road at that moment." "As do I," Dorothy whispered, turning in his arms to face him. "My rescuer, my husband, my love." Their kiss was sweet with shared memories and sweeter still with the promise of all the years to come, years that would bring more children, more challenges, more joy than either could have imagined on that dusty Colorado road where their story began. For Dorothy Everhart Nichols, sold by her stepfather but saved by love, life had come full circle. The girl who had once been treated as property had found not just freedom but belonging. And in Patrick's arms, under the vast star-strewn sky of the Colorado Territory, she was finally, completely home.